Hi there, I'm going to show you how you can insert a centered zip like the one that I've done here. So the centered zip is one where you have visible stitching all the way around the zip, and where you pull back those flaps there you can see that the teeth are centered all the way down that seam line. This sort of zip can be used on any garment. It's also quite good for cushions or for bags, so it's quite a useful technique to know how to do. For your sample you're going to need 2 bits of fabric. Now these measure about 28 centimetres long by, what's that, 6.5 centimetres, so something like that. So they should be the same size, and you'll also need a zip to give this a go. So this is just a regular closed end zip, and this zip is about 8 inches long or 20 centimetres. So what you need to make sure is that your strips of fabric are a little bit longer than your zip that you're going to put into the seam. And you're also going to need a zip foot. So my zip foot for my machine looks like this. Yours might look a little bit different, but it will just be a slightly narrower version of your machine foot. It might look something like this. This is my other zip foot that I have, which is a universal zip foot, and it's just a very slim end on the foot, which allows you to stitch close to the teeth without the foot getting in the way when you sew. So I'm going to take this piece and put it right sides together with the other piece, and then I'm going to take my zip and use this as a measure first of all. So I match the top of the tape to the top edge of the fabric, and then put a marker where the zip stop comes to. So that's where the zip stop is, so I'm going to just put a marker there on the edge of the fabric. You can use chalk, or you could even just put a pin there, but you just need to make a mark where the zip stop comes to. What I'll do next is, on the sewing machine I'm going to sew a regular seam allowance, so for me that's 1.5 centimetres in, and I'm going to do a long machine stitch to the marker and then a regular length stitch for the rest of the seam. So a long machine stitch here, change the machine setting to do a shorter stitch, back tack at that point to secure my stitches, and then continue and finish the seam off, back tacking at the bottom. And the reason I do that is because the long machine stitches here will help me to centre where the zip's going to go, but I want to take them out afterwards. So I'm going to take this over to the machine and stitch the first part. I'm going to turn my sewing machine stitch length up to 4, so that's my longest stitch. So I'm using a long stitch and a seam allowance of 1.5 centimetres. And when I get to my marker, I'm going to change my stitch length back to a regular stitch, so that's 2.5 on my machine. And at this point I'm going to just back tack to secure my stitches, and then I will carry on my seam and then back tack again at the end to secure. So I've done my long machine stitch here up to my marker, and then my regular length stitch for the bottom of the seam. So then my next step is to open up the seam and to press open the seam allowance. At this stage, if I was making a garment or anything else that required a zip, I would edge finish the seam allowance before I carried on, but because this is just a sample I'm going to miss that bit out. So I'm going to take my zip, I'm going to make sure that the top edge here is where my long machine stitching is, and I take the zip and I place it face down so the top of the tape meets the top edge of the fabric there. And the reason that I do this is because if this was a garment, then I'd need that part of the seam allowance into the seam allowance of a seam that went across here. So don't ever position it like this. It should always, as a general rule, it should always be with the top of the tape matching the top of the fabric. So I'm going to pin the zip in place, and as I pin the zip in place I'm going to centre it. So I've got that positioned there at the top, and then I can just make sure that the zip teeth there are going centrally down the seam that I've just made. When I pin, I'm pinning all the way through to the other side. When I pin, I'm pinning all the way through to the other side, so not just through the seam allowances but all the way through, and checking as I put the zip in place that it is staying centered where I want it to go. You can usually tell if you've done it correctly how it sits within the seam allowance, so there's usually a little bit of seam poking out from either end, and then you know you have centered it properly. Okay, now that that's pinned in place, I'm going to hand tack it in place before I then sew it on the machine. So I've got some contrast thread. What I find is when I ask my students to do to tack things in place, they generally do giant stitches that don't hold anything together because they really hate hand sewing. That isn't really going to work when you're trying to put in a zip, so don't make your stitches too big. So I'm going to start from this end. So I've just threaded up my needle and I've tied a knot in one end of the thread, and I'll just start from this top edge here, and I'm stitching all the way through down the centre of the tape, all the way through to the right side of the fabric. And my stitches are about 1 centimetre in length. I'm just going to do that all the way down this side. Doesn't matter whereabouts on the tape you actually stitch, I generally aim for the centre. And these stitches is much easier to have the zip tacked in place than try to sew it with the pins in place, especially if you've not really put many zips into things. When I get to the zip stop, I'm going to just take my stitch here just in front of where the zip stop is, because actually when I come to here I want to stitch on the sewing machine before I get to the zip stop. I certainly don't want to try and sew through the zip stop because as it's metal it will probably break the needle. So then I just come back up the other side with the hand stitches. And then when I get to the top here, just make a couple of stitches so that that's secure, and then I can cut my thread. And now I can take all of the pins out. And you can see that I've hand tacked the zip in place all the way round, and you can see those stitches on the right side. That's important that you do go all the way through, else your zip is not going to be held securely. So now that's done, I'm going to go back to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch the zip in place. Before I do that, I'm going to just use an unpicker and just run the unpicker through the stitches near the top of the zip. Just be careful when you do that you don't cut a hole in your fabric. So I've just opened the top bit there because I want to be able to just open the zip slightly to help me sew around the zip hole. Okay, then I'm going to take my zip foot and go and sew it on the machine. I need to change the foot on the machine first, so you'll probably find that there's a button to press just behind the shank of your presser fit, so that I can remove that one and I can just snap this one back on, and it gives me the option of being able to attach it to the left or to the right. And what I'm going to do is to attach it to the left side, and I'm going to start stitching on the left side of the zip. So this is the side I'll be stitching on the left side of the zip. If you try and do the foot this side and sew this side, you'll find that the needle's in the position here, and so we'll probably miss the zip tape, and also you've got the foot in the way of the zip teeth. So there's only really one way this is going to work, and that's this way. What I want to try and do is to keep an even distance from the fold here. Sometimes on different zip feet you can actually use the edge of the foot as a guide, but because of the shape of this foot, that doesn't really help. I'm going to start from the top left here, and I'm going to try and keep my stitching about 1/2 centimetre in from this folded edge. So I'll take a couple of stitches back and forth to get started. And I'm going to open up the zip here as far as you've unpicked it to. And then when you get near to that zip head, lift up the foot with the needle still in the fabric, and then just pull on the zip head and close the zip back up. If you're having trouble doing that, just pull the needle out slightly so the tip's just in the fabric, and that will help you to pull the zip up and out of the way. And then carry on stitching. And I've got my stitch marked here, which tells me that's the point at which I want to cross over the zip. You could have marked that with your stitch, or you could use a pin, and just make sure that it's just above where the zip stop is, so you're not sewing through the metal. Leave the needle in the fabric and pivot, and then stitch across the zip, and it should be able to stitch across there. And try and make the same number of stitches on either side of the seam, and then you can see whether or not you've gone far enough over. Perhaps just take another stitch. That looks like that's in a better position now, so I can come back up the other side of the zip. And as you get close to the top, leave the needle in the fabric again, lift up the foot, and then just open the zip, and then carry on stitching. So this is my finished stitch zip, and all I need to do next is just to unpick all of my tacking stitches that I did, and they should come out quite easily. And then I need to just finish unpicking my long machine stitches that are keeping that seam closed. Then you'll find you've got all these little bits in that seam that you can pull out. So that's my finished centered zip, and you can see that the teeth are centered in the seam there, and you get these little flaps of fabric which should cover the zip while it's in the seam. So for the best finish technique, you want to just make sure that you've got your stitches are parallel, that they're an equal distance from that fold, and that the teeth is centered in the middle. So that's my centered zip finished. I just need to edge finish the sample, and that can go into my file.